LGBTQ community the platform and the voice that they deserve.
There's never been a better moment than right now.
The 19th is the newsroom that we've been waiting for.
Hi everyone, and welcome to Live with the 19th, where we aim to give you a front row seat to conversations at the intersection of gender, politics, and public policy. I'm Amanda Zamora, co-founder and publisher of The 19th, an independent nonprofit newsroom that aims to empower you with the information, resources, and community you need to be equal participants in our democracy. The rise of anti-AAPI violence across the nation has been harrowing, and its impact on women and the LGBTQ+ community outsized. Today, the 19th's General Assignment reporter Mariel Padilla is in conversation with U.S. Senator Mazie Hirono of Hawaii, U.S. Representative Grace Meng of Queens, New York, and author and consultant Kim Tran to learn the history behind harassment targeting Asian Americans and to discuss community-level and policy solutions for this growing problem. After their conversation, we will have a special performance of Gold by Ella J. Basco and Ruby Ibarra. Before we get started, we'd like to thank our sponsor, the Asian American Foundation. Their founding president, Sonal Shah, will share a few words before we get started.
Hi, my name is Sonal Shah. I am the president and a board member of the Asian American Foundation, also known as TAF. And I am thrilled to be a part of the 19th commemoration of Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month. Every May, we come together to celebrate the vibrancy of the AAPI history and our experiences. But this year, we're also grappling with a tough reality. Anti-AAPI hate is at an all-time high. Our communities are under attack. In 2021 alone, there have been more than 2,400 reported incidents of anti-AAPI hate. Nearly 65% of these incidents have targeted AAPI women who face the intersecting threats of racism, xenophobia, and misogyny. We launched TAF this spring to confront hate, violence, and discrimination, and to make this a country where AAPIs have the opportunity to succeed, thrive, and belong. AAPIs make up 7% of the US population, 12% of the professional workforce, but we hold just 1.5% of corporate officer positions in Fortune 500 companies and just 3% of the seats in Congress. In popular culture, Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders are not only wildly underrepresented, we're tokenized and we're stereotyped. And when it comes to investments in our communities, AAPIs receive less than 0.5% of charitable giving from foundations. TAF aims to change that. It is why last week at the White House, we announced that we have raised $1.1 billion in funding from foundations, from individuals and corporations for AAPI causes, initiatives, and communities. We are a convener, an incubator, and funder dedicated to support the advocates and organizations already working hard to combat anti-AAPI hate. We're bringing together partners from business, from philanthropy, from politics, and more to support and celebrate the 23 million Asian Americans living in the United States. That is why TAF is so proud to be a part of today's event. Standing up for our communities has never been more important, especially for women and LGBTQ+ communities who are disproportionately impacted by hate and violence. So thank you to the 19th for empowering our communities through your reporting and your efforts, and for telling our stories that are too often going untold.
A quick reminder that while sponsors help keep Live with the 19th free for viewers to attend, they play no part in the programming of our events. As today's conversation gets going, we hope you'll share it on social media using the hashtag #the19thlive. And if you're not already, please be sure to sign up for our free newsletter at 19thnews.org/subscribe, where you can find out about upcoming 19th News events. Now, let's introduce our panelists. Senator Mazie Hirono was elected to the Senate in 2012 and sworn in as Hawaii's first female senator and the country's first Asian American woman senator. Congresswoman Grace Meng is serving her 5th term in the U.S. House, where she represents New York's 6th congressional district. Representative Meng is the first and only Asian American member of Congress from New York. Kim Tran is an anti-racist author and consultant researching solidarity in the Black Lives Matter era. She holds a Ph.D. in ethnic studies from UC Berkeley. Now, let's welcome Mariel.
All right, thanks, Amanda. Hi, everyone. I'm excited to be here with Senator Mazie Hirono, Representative Grace Meng, and Kim Tran to discuss the Asian American perspective on the pandemic, racism, and violence. Between March 2020 and March 2021, more than 6,600 hate incidents were reported to Stop AAPI Hate, the coalition of community organizations, and nearly 65% of those were reported by women who said they were targeted. So to kick off the conversation, I want to start with the recent passing of the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act, which was officially signed into law by President Joe Biden. What motivated the bill and what does it aim to do for the AAPI community? We can start with Senator Hirono.
Well, we knew that there have been an increasing, there have been a rise in hate crimes against AAPI, Asian American Pacific Islander community over the more than the last year. And so the last session, Kamala Harris, Tammy Duckworth, and I had introduced a resolution condemning these kinds of crimes. And then this year with my good friend Grace Meng and others in the House, that we introduced an actual bill basically to set up a process whereby we can really find out what the incidents of these crimes and incidents are, and therefore inform us as to what steps we can take that will prevent and effectively enable us to fight back.
Yeah, the incidents have increased exponentially over the last year and a half or so. But what we know is that most jurisdictions actually don't even report these bias incidents and hate crimes to the Department of Justice, and we just don't have a complete and accurate enough picture of what's going on. So like with any public health crisis, we need to have better statistics, for example, like with gun violence. And so what we're trying to do here is to make sure there's actually someone at the Department of Justice reviewing these cases ongoing around the country, collecting the data, and then working with local entities to make it easier for victims to report these types of incidents online and in different languages. Part of this legislation also has a public education component where we will expand efforts to talk about hate crimes and to provide more outreach to victims and potential victims as well.
Let me just add very briefly that, yes, these crimes and incidents are very underreported, but the bill has the word incidents in there because we don't want just the reporting of crimes, things that rise to the level of crimes, but there are incidents such as if you're being called by a racial epithet, etc. Not that we're going to prosecute those people, but we should understand the kind of environment that AAPIs are having to exist in, and going out the door, and you can be verbally attacked. So these are the word incidents, which, by the way, the Department of Justice, when I was working on the language, said, well, that's very vague. But I said it's really important to put that in there, and so it is.
Right. And speaking of that increase in reporting of hate incidents against Asian Americans, and there, as you said, there have been reports of Asian Americans being attacked and harassed when they leave their, homes. And then there were the awful Atlanta shootings last April that left 6 Asian women dead. And as I'm sure you all know, this animosity towards the AAPI community is not new. Kim, can you speak on what racism has looked like for the AAPI community, both in this moment and historically?
Yeah, thanks so much, Mariel. One of the things I want to stress in this moment is that what we're seeing is racial scapegoating, right? It's blaming a particular racial community for specifically the uptick in pandemic violence or in, the pandemic itself. And that is in no way, shape, or form something that is new in America. Specifically when it comes to Asian Americans, this relationship of pinning disease on Asian Americans has gone back as far as the 1800s. That being said, what we're seeing right now exists because we can reach for that story. It's a really convenient place to go. It's a really easy place to go. I actually think it's going to be really sticky to get us out of here in terms of the measures and the actions that we do right now.
Can either Senator Hirono or Representative Meng weigh in on how they feel this past year has been different or not different for the AAPI community?
Well, racism against the AAPI community, as well as to other marginalized groups, and of course, the systemic racism against the Black community is not new, as mentioned. So we have the Chinese Exclusion Act in the 1880s. We have the internment of Japanese Americans in World War II. We have the Muslim ban. And so this kind of treatment of AAPIs as the other, the perpetual foreigners, unfortunately, is not new in our country. And so eternal vigilance is required. And during the pandemic, of course, when you have the former president calling the virus, the Chinese virus, and having members of his administration refer to it as Kung Flu, creates an environment where people with this kind of animus toward our community think that it's okay somehow to attack us. And at the same time, we've seen the horrific imagery of AAPI people being attacked and others just standing around doing nothing. So there's obviously a lot more that we have to do than the passage of this law.
Yeah, definitely. I want to echo the senator's comments. While we are really happy and grateful that this piece of legislation was signed into law and we can make sure that we are getting a more complete picture of what's happening and what is needed, this is one piece of the puzzle of the solution that is a lot more holistic, and like Kim alluded to, it's going to still be a long road ahead. I think this is a good opportunity to also address issues like mental health. Many of the cases in New York City, in my home city, have been perpetrated by people who suffer from mental health issues. And whether we're talking about more robust investment in mental health services for perpetrators or for victims or for our community in general, which already was lacking, we definitely need to do more in that space. And also education, we've talked about a little bit about the history of how Asian Americans have been scapegoated in this country. It's a part of our American history, but not everyone has learned about it. In fact, most kids probably don't learn about it. I barely learned beyond maybe a paragraph when I was in school about parts of our history, whether it's the Chinese Exclusion Act, the Muslim ban, or Japanese incarceration camps, so much that we want to make sure our kids are learning a more complete history of what our American history is and who it includes. Asian Americans have been viewed as invisible or foreigners our whole lives. And you saw that with the recent poll or survey I saw where almost 50% of people couldn't even name an Asian American that wasn't Bruce Lee or Jackie Chan. So clearly we need more education.
I'm so excited to hear you both say that this is a greater piece of the kind of tapestry that we're working with, in large part because what we're seeing has a lot to do with other issues, low income or affordable housing. A lot of these incidents, including in California, were perpetrated by people who were both unhoused and had been institutionalized for mental health reasons. So for me, hate crimes legislature kind of addresses something after it's occurred, right? When what we need to do really as a society is think about how we prevent these incidents from occurring in the first place. And that looks a lot like, compulsory ethnic studies. It looks a lot like funding community organizations that are doing these community ambassador programs on the ground. So both of these things have to happen at the same time. I think for me, in large part, because hate crimes sentence enhancements can be meted out really unevenly when it comes to racial patterns and racial bias.
Yeah, if I could add to that, Kim, we absolutely agree. And to your point and to the senator's point, the goal is not to lock more people up for hate crime prosecutions. And in fact, this legislation, the part that was written by Representative Beyer, has a counseling piece. This is already law in New York State, for example, where a court or judge could require counseling and education instead of incarceration for people who are convicted of hate crimes.
Great. As you've mentioned, Representative Meng, Asian Americans are often seen as invisible, overlooked, and treated as a monolith, honestly. And so I'm wondering, as we're talking about solutions moving forward, how are you thinking about the unique experience of different Asian Americans moving forward?
Sure. So obviously, the legislation that was just signed into law is one part, and comes at, sort of the back end of all that's happening. And the front and the middle is just as important. Asian Americans have really been viewed as foreigners or invisible in our history books, our budget books, our research data. So there's so much more that we need more equity from investment by our government, and even philanthropic efforts, which have really left out most of the Asian American community. And we're sort of seeing that, right, with this new foundation that was created, the Asian American Foundation, where we're asking for more equity from philanthropic sources, but also with government. In my home city of New York, we're over 15% of the population, but we get less than 1% of the funding for groups that serve and protect our community. So we need, more parity there. And really education. We're working on legislation nationally with members of the Black and Latino caucus, and Native American members of Congress as well, to make sure that our curriculum is more diverse and inclusive when, targeting the K through 12 grade levels. And I know that there are a lot of efforts in state legislatures around the country as well.
Let me just add briefly that the dominant culture's history is depicted in what we learn in school. And things like Asian studies or ethnic studies, those are called electives. They need to be part of the core curriculum. And not to mention, what also needs to be taught is what happened to the Native peoples, because they have been decimated by the dominant culture. So that history is also not taught. The AAPI community represents over 45 ethnic groups, and with over 100 languages spoken, definitely not a monolithic group. There are huge economic disparities. So, we should get rid of this whole model minority myth once and for all, and ask for disaggregated data among of the AAPI community, something that Grace and I have sought to do with regard to education disparities and others. So we know what's really happening and how groups within the AAPI community are being impacted, of course, disproportionately by the pandemic.
I'd love to echo that, Senator Hirono, and also build a little bit, because I think when we disaggregate the data, what we find is different communities are enduring this moment, and some of us are bearing a much greater burden, right? So Vietnamese women experience the same pay gap compared to white men as Black women, somewhere in the neighborhood of 61 to 63 cents for every dollar. Trans Asian Americans are the poorest racial group within trans Americans, and LGBTQ Asians experience workplace discrimination at a rate of, we're reporting at a rate of about upwards of 70%. So one of the things that I think is really important to remember in this moment is that Asian Americans are not monolithic in any way, shape, or form. And when we start digging around in the data, what we're finding is the issues change a little bit. So if you were to ask me, a queer Vietnamese woman, what I thought we needed in this moment, it would be abolition. It would be defunding the police. It would be not necessarily funneling our energy into thinking about increasing a police footprint in communities of color that are marginalized, but really moving forward with things like political education, with grassroots organizers, and knowing that movements work, that there are Asian American, trans people, and queer people who've been in these movements for a long time, and we've gone without resources for far too long.
Yes. So the community-based organizations that actually are on the ground working with all of these different groups, we need to fund those, because that's one of the ways that we are going to focus on prevention as opposed to incarceration.
Definitely. And one piece I liked about our legislation, which the Republicans did not like, but it was like Representative Chip Roy, was that it required our federal government to not just work with local law enforcement, but also community organizations, the Department of Health, the Health Equity Task Force, which was sort of mocked by the Republicans, but like Kim said, is very important. So many of our communities, especially when you break down the data, have been served disproportionately and funded so many programs, the social network, wraparound services that are so desperately needed. And in that space too, we need more disaggregated data.
If I may, I took a look at the bill when it was passed, and one of the things that I will be quite honest, I'm extremely concerned about is sentence enhancements around the language of hate crimes. Is there a guarantee that racist ideas, racism, structural and interpersonal, won't creep into decision-making around what constitutes a hate crime against Asian Americans?
First of all, the bill doesn't change any of the existing laws relating to hate crimes. There are a lot of states that do not even have hate crimes legislation. What the bill seeks to do is to raise at least the awareness that when something can be deemed a hate crime. And I use Georgia as an example. When it first happened, it wasn't even viewed as a hate crime, and to have the police officers there let the perpetrator decide the narrative was really totally crazy and unacceptable. So it doesn't change any of the laws, but yes, Kim, if what we see is disparate policing along these lines, then that's an area that we're going to need to address, just as we're moving to address disparate policing with regard to particularly the Black community.
Yeah, the bill doesn't specifically address policing or police violence or how communities may feel about police violence. And that's, I'll just put an extra plug why the Republican leadership in the Senate, because we know our senators are mostly supportive of it, need to pass legislation like the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act right away, which would address a lot of our concerns. But it goes towards providing accountability for most of the law enforcement jurisdictions who are literally reporting 0 hate crimes in any given year around the country. But I totally hear your concern, Kim. The bill doesn't specifically address that, and that's not an aim or intent of the bill.
Can I ask what accountability means in that regard, Congressman? So there are police departments that, I mean, I would be honest with you, I wouldn't report an incident of anti-Asian violence because I don't feel safe around police as a queer person. That's not a safe thing for me to do. And I try my best to disengage entirely with police in any way, shape, or form because they increase violence in Southeast Asian and other communities of color. So what then does accountability mean? Because I did also see that in the bill, and I was curious about, again, how that might be constituted differently and doled out unevenly.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there's a wide spectrum of response to law enforcement from the AAPI community, right? You have people who are literally calling for more police presence in response to this situation, and you have communities who don't feel safe at all reporting or even with increased police presence in their communities to address this solution. But what it does do is modernize the way that incidents have been reported. So for example, when you look at the past cases, which were biased incidents and crimes of the Ibarra family and the Hire family, where we saw incidents of anti-Arab and white supremacy, those were not reported as hate crimes. I think less than 15% of jurisdictions report that there were any bias incidents in any given year at all. So it really just modernizes the system under which data is collected. It's really voluntary now. And we just want to make sure that the system is modernized where they are held accountable in how they're investigating.
I also view accountability as what decisions are made after we gather the data, after we understand more what is happening with regard to hate crimes throughout our country. And when I say accountability, it is the decisions that we make based on this kind of information. What are the appropriate actions that we can take so that the society itself and the police and all of us become more accountable to what is happening. So that is how I view the accountability piece too.
I also want to throw in something that's slightly related. I think it is a chance for us to take a look at sentencing, take a look at mental health responses, because I want to put a plug in for a bill that Rep. Katie Porter is pushing in terms, and she has about I've been helping her, but over 100 co-sponsors now, where we're training more mental health experts as first responders, so that we are not just seeing people who might have a mental health issue have to automatically dial 911, for example. So that's an example of a program that we should take a look at.
Yeah, I think now is the moment to define what we mean by these overarching terms like justice and accountability. I cut my teeth in providing direct services for queer and trans youth at a mental health center. And I can tell you that police can be a giant inhibition to getting what young queer and trans folks of color need. So what this moment really calls for is actually reevaluating how our communities know what safety means, what justice is, what accountability is. Because if we're going to create thriving communities, we really need to think about something other than locking people up and throwing away the key.
I agree. And that is why the community-based groups, the advocates like you, are critical to this process. And we tend to have a mentality in our country of not looking to the sources and looking to providing resources for the prevention side of things. We always wait until something already happens and then we rush in. But I've been long an advocate of prevention. And why is that so hard? Because it's generally deemed harder to figure out ways to prevent something from happening than to respond after it happens. But I am with you, Kim, and needing to focus more on the prevention side of the criminal justice system.
And Kim, we'd love to work with you because the passage of this bill into law is really just step one. The next steps and the harder steps is how the Department of Justice and Attorney General Garland will work with our local communities and implement the bill. So we would love to work with you to get some real substantive solutions and how the bill can be implemented so it pairs with restorative justice and we're not making our community, our most vulnerable members of our community, uncomfortable.
I'm so excited to hear that. One of my greatest aims in this work is to build bridges because we so often work in silos. I think you as policymakers, organizers, and also, people who are impacted by what happens at the levels of state violence and at the levels of community work and at the levels of scholarship can be completely alienated from each other. And you have really important things happening that need to be connected in these tremendous ways so that our communities can be safe and walk down the street without worry and without concern.
And one of the most promising things, I was just watching the news this morning and I saw all of these AAPI young people, 17, 15-year-olds, and they're getting out there. And one young person, he was only 15, and he said he wants to do something. He can't just sit there. It's really reassuring because maybe when I was 15, I wasn't exactly marching around. That came a little later, but this kind of desire to be a part of the change that needs to happen really gives me hope.
You know, I just trained 100 youth from across the country on bystander intervention.
Yes.
They are ready.
Thank you.
They are activated.
Yes.
They know why we don't call the cops. They know that you need to accompany our elders. They're ready to build consent. And we just have to build the scaffolding to let them do the really important and wonderful work that they're ready to do.
Going off of what you said about, the future of the movement, Kim, I know your research explores the solidarity between Asian and Black Americans, and I'm wondering if you can speak a bit on how, the Black Lives Matter movement and the anti-Asian movement, how they've intersected in the past and how you kind of see them interacting in the future.
Yeah, so my research is specifically on Asian American solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement. And what we've seen since 2014, 2015 is BLM changed the way that a lot of communities envision solidarity across racial groups. So it doesn't really matter if we're talking about Standing Rock or Asians for Black Lives or the contemporary abolition movement. BLM has in so many ways changed the game. And the way forward has been really clear. We've seen that for the last 5 years. Folks are really aware that racial justice is going to take both holding our own experiences of racism and understanding that other communities experience very discrete and oftentimes separate things from us at the same time. And as a society, we're actually learning how to do that. Movement folks are teaching us how to do that every day. So Asians for Black Lives that formed at the kind of beginning alongside Black Lives Matter is a great example of the way that Asian folks can simultaneously talk about colonialism and imperialism while also saying we need to upend anti-Blackness. And we'll chain ourselves to the Oakland Federal Building to do that, or to the Oakland Police Department. We saw the same thing at Standing Rock, where folks of color were there, but they weren't Indigenous. And they were just learning on their feet and taking big risks and getting arrested so that we could prevent the Dakota Access Pipeline. So what we're seeing is a lot of motivation, a lot of energy, and a new definition of what solidarity looks like.
Yes. And of course, what happens when all of our groups come together in solidarity is that there is a backlash. And so that's one of the reasons that there are a lot of people afraid of minority groups and marginalized groups coming together, and heaven forbid that they should be voting. And so you have, hundreds and hundreds of bills being considered to suppress our votes and to steal our votes. And so part of what I would like to see happen is for us to recognize and connect the dots that this kind of stealing of our votes is one of the ways that they're going to continue to marginalize our joint efforts, and we have to fight back. So the kind of money that is being put into voter suppression is awesome. So the same groups that put in a lot of money, dark money, to pack our courts with the most ideologically right-wing people who are, this is why there are so many cases now going to this Supreme Court where the expectation is there will be a majority to not uphold LGBTQ rights and not uphold voter rights, not uphold, the kind of policing that we want. So you name it. And now these folks, having packed the courts with over 200 Trump nominees, including 3 to the Supreme Court, they are turning their resources into stealing our votes. That is what's happening. And so there's always there is this huge backlash effort going on, even as we strengthen. It's also why it's happening, the backlash.
something what Kim was saying as well about allyship. I will say that it's been incredibly encouraging and even therapeutic as we participate in so many Zooms and rallies about bigotry towards Asian Americans. But the bigger and more challenging part of the actions that we need to see happen are the tough conversations that we need to have within our own community. When I'm going to rallies, you know, I say to people who are there, the Asian people, I said, you know, please don't just come out when it's racism directed at our community. We need to be out there for every community. And I think it's really because of the Black Lives Matters movement that so many of these conversations have been initiated, right? So many Asian American young people who went home and their families asked them, why were you at a BLM protest? And we were able to ignite a lot of these challenging conversations. What we're trying to do locally is, I just had a conversation this morning with one of our largest Chinese ethnic papers, you know, and I said to them, you know, when a perpetrator of a hate crime is white, you don't talk about their race or anything like that. But when they're Black or Latino, you know, you always include their race, and you maybe there are ways where we can contextualize these stories in a more responsible fashion, where we're able to learn more about each other's communities and learn about the allyship. You know, just a few days ago was the birthdays of both Malcolm X and Yuri Kochiyama, and a lot of Asian Americans, including myself when I was younger, had not learned about their history and how Malcolm X helped the Japanese American community get reparations. These are parts of history that we need to make sure our own community understands.
As someone with an ethnic studies PhD, I completely understand that. And I also agree with the fact that we need to know our history. I think in this moment, one of the things I'm really struggling with is the fact that we don't know ourselves as an Asian American community. Because as much as we want to talk about Yuri Kochiyama, I also want to talk about K-Town for Black Lives. I also want to talk about Asians for Abolition. And I absolutely want to talk about Viet Unity, because there are so many Asian Americans who are intersectionally talking about what abolition looks like, what racial justice looks like, who have been striving for these goals for decades, right? We saw solidarity between Asian and Black communities post-Hurricane Katrina. We saw it again with Asians for Black Lives and across history and time. So I actually don't necessarily think it's the fact that we don't know our history. A large part of it is that we don't know our present.
I think that's a good point, Kim, because one, we also don't know our history, and that would help if we learned all that, not as an elective. But also, I think it is really important that we are at the space where all these efforts to divide and conquer, because they love to do that. They love to not have, you know, all of our groups coming together, because these divide and conquer tactics works to pit one marginalized group against another marginalized groups. And I think there is such a awareness now of that kind of manipulative efforts taking place, and that we will withstand it. And I am hopeful that we are finally at a point where this is going to be a sustained kind of solidarity and not one that will just go away. I think the awareness goes a lot deeper now. And especially when I see the younger people being so much more activists at a really young age. And then you also have really the young people who are wanting us to face the gun violence in our country, and all of that. I think that there is this sense that by coming together we can get things done, but there's still a huge backlash. Lots of people with a lot of money who want us to not succeed.
It looks like we have time for one more question. So I want to ask on a more personal note, you know, as high profile public members of the Asian American community yourself, how has this past year personally affected you? And does this moment feel like a galvanizing moment for Asian Americans, or does it feel like something that you've experienced before?
So I will say that this year has been really challenging in the sense that xenophobia is something that I haven't personally experienced in my life before. So just having folks, zip up their coats when they're around me or pull their masks up or cross the street has been really challenging. At the same time, I am extremely excited by the fact that the national conversation is much more nuanced than it used to be. I think we're still privileging the wrong voices. I still see a lot of cisgender, straight, light-skinned, thin Asian Americans taking up mainstream space. But my hope is that once we have the mic, we can give it over to the queer and trans Asian American organizers, the Black Asian American organizers, the folks who grew up poor, have been incarcerated, who have been doing racial justice work for so long, to really tell us what a map to racial justice looks like. So I'm excited, I'm saddened, and at the end of the day, I'm really hopeful.
Yeah, I share that. I am hopeful. You can't be in politics without, but by being a total cynic. You see the battles, the way I framed it is that so many of the battles that we thought we had won don't stay won. And so eternal vigilance is required. Clearly, we don't have racial justice. We don't even have equal opportunity in our country. Massive gender issues and sexism along all kinds of lines exist in our country. And so eternal vigilance, and there's always a lot of space for others to continue to fight the battle. But I am hopeful. We just need to sustain this energy and this commitment.
I think for the majority part of this last year, I felt a lot of frustration because I felt like our community, like people say we're invisible, but we're really not. We were yelling and screaming about what was going on, begging the former president and the Republican Party not to use incendiary language. And it just seemed like no one was listening to us. And even in so many spaces that I was in, I often will have to remind people that the AAPI community has to be included. And we are often completely left out of the conversation, even amongst allies. But I will say, after we started seeing more attacks on the elderly and the murders in Atlanta, unfortunately, the mainstream communities and media started to pay more attention. And I will say that as sad and as unfortunate as the situations were, I felt a huge sense of relief. I felt like for the first time in my life, people finally noticed our community, even though we've been here and we were part of building this country, literally. But people finally started to recognize us and to include us. I don't even want to know the number of politicians on both sides of the aisle and different entities, whether academic or corporate, who probably held like the very first AAPI Heritage Month, event, which is largely symbolic and celebratory, but at least they were taking that initial step to, have these conversations, which many people felt like they've never really witnessed before in the places that they worked or, wherever they are. So I feel very hopeful too. And like Kim said, these conversations are more nuanced. They're harder to have. It's not just about, we're not satisfied with just a Lunar New Year celebration event anymore. We want to have real conversations and for people to understand that even people within our own communities might have different levels of, types of solutions, but that's okay. That's how we're going to get better and get better solutions.
Great. Well, I think that's a great place to wrap up. Thanks again so much to all three of you for taking the time to have this important conversation. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Mariel and Kim and Grace.
Thank you so much for that important and enlightening discussion. I am now thrilled to introduce Ella J. Basco and Ruby Ibarra with a special performance of Ella J's recently released Gold, a song they wrote as an anthem for the AAPI community. Ella J. Basco made her big screen debut in Birds of Prey and the fantabulous Emancipation of One Harley Quinn as DC Comics' Cassandra Cain. Basco is a dancer, singer, songwriter, and accomplished musician. Ruby Ibarra is a rapper and spoken word artist from California's Bay Area. Since releasing her debut album Circa 91 in 2017, Ibarra has been steadily promoting her iTunes and Amazon charting record through live and virtual tours across the US, Canada, and Asia.
Hey everyone, my name is LJ Basco, and this is Gold featuring Ruby Ibarra. Shout out to the 19th for having us. Hope you guys enjoy. Headed to I'm dipped in gold, and I know that'll break the mold. When you learn to love your true reflection, yeah, then you'll always be rich with a gold complexion. I don't need your silverware or your unfair comparisons, 'cause I know my hair is darker than hers is. I'm looking at photographs, all the California girls are smiling back, but it don't matter if I don't look like them. Sometimes I never win, but I was blessed with a golden skin. Don't stress about where you've been, just look inside, find what's within. Girl, you know you're beautiful, stand tall, unmovable, it's undisputable. You a boss bitch as usual, you a boss bitch as usual. Headed to a midden gold,
head to toe, I'm dipped in gold.
And I know that'll break the mold.
I'ma break the mold, yeah, I'ma break the mold.
When you learn to love your true reflection, yeah, then you'll always be rich with a gold complexion.
Hey, hey, hey. I look around and I wonder if I'm good enough. But what's good enough if I don't love myself enough? They tell me toughen up, but I can never make the cut. Just give it up, I'm feeling like I'm falling and I'm on the cusp. Brown girl, gold crown, watch me hold down, watch me go around, scream it loud, 'cause I know now everything I am, from my name to my hometown, is everything that's planned, 'cause today I'm a glow now. They think I'm that girl, tell me how to act, girl, put me in the back like I'm trapped and I lack words, but I'm that girl, never falling flat, girl. Cast me in, they see that it's a rap where I'm at, world, 'cause I'm that girl, assassin on the track, girl, no question if I will, or a cane like I'm back, girl. I'm a boss bitch and I'm beautiful.
You're a boss bitch that's beautiful.
Yeah, you a boss bitch and it's beautiful.
Headed to I'm dipped in gold,
head to toe, I'm dipped in gold.
And I know that'll break the mold.
I'ma break the mold, yeah, I'ma break the mold.
When you learn to love your true reflection, yeah, then you'll always be rich with a gold complexion. Headed to I'm dipped in gold,
head to toe, I'm dipped in gold.
And I know that'll break the mold.
I'ma break the mold, yeah, I'ma break the mold.
When you learn to love your true reflection, yeah, then you'll always be rich with a gold complexion. I'm brown and I'm proud,
brown and I'm proud,
I'm brown and I'm proud,
I'm brown and I'm proud,
I'm brown and I'm proud,
yeah, 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 yeah.
I'm brown and I'm proud,
Brown and I'm proud,
I'm brown and I'm proud,
I'm brown and I'm proud,
I'm brown and I'm proud, yeah, yeah. Thank you so much for having us.
What an incredible performance. Thank you, ladies, and to all of you for tuning in. And a special thank you to our sponsor, the Asian American Foundation, for making today's event possible. We hope you'll join us June 9th for our next 19th Represents event, a day of critical conversations on the state of our nation's care infrastructure and the vital role caregivers play in our society and economy. To get those event details, head to 19thnews.org/events. And finally, thank you to everyone who donated during our spring member drive. The 19th now has 10,596 members supporting our nonprofit newsroom. It is your contributions that make conversations like today's possible. If you're not a member yet, you can show your support today by donating at 19thnews.org/membership. We look forward to welcoming you to the 19th family, and we'll see you at our next event.